April 25, 1945. The sky above the Obersalzberg is the color of slate, heavy with snow that hasn't yet decided to fall. An American sergeant from the 3rd Infantry Division, his name is Robert Miller, from Pennsylvania, 23 years old, a former machinist who has been in Europe for 11 months, stands at the base of a brass elevator door embedded in the side of a mountain, 6,000 feet above the valley floor. The door is warm to the touch, heated from within by mechanisms he cannot see. Behind him, the Berchtesgaden Valley spreads out like a map, drawn by someone who never expected it to be seen from this angle. Farms the size of postage stamps, the Königssee, a silver thread between peaks that still hold winter snow in their high cirques. The elevator shaft? He will later write to his wife in a letter that survives in the National Archives, descends 400 feet straight down into living rock. Not up, down. The entire structure he's been told to secure sits on top of a mountain, but you reach it by going into the mountain first, then rising through its crown like a miner ascending from depths he cannot fathom. When the elevator arrives and the door opens, nobody is inside. Just that brass and leather interior, immaculate, smelling faintly of machine oil and something else he can't identify. Something floral, like roses. The smell, he will realize later, is Eva Braun's perfume, still lingering in the enclosed space days after she was last here. The Americans had expected fortifications, gun emplacements, bunkers with walls thick enough to withstand artillery. And they find a tea house with windows that frame the Alps like paintings in a museum no one visits. Before we descend, 2 things. Drop a comment with where you're watching from tonight, and if you're new here, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of slow, honest investigation into what we don't yet understand. The Eagle's Nest sits at an elevation of 6,117 feet on the peak of the Kelstein, a subsummit of the Hoher Gerl in the Bavarian Alps, 7 kilometers south-southeast of the town of Berchtesgaden. On clear days, you can see into Austria to the south and west. On clearer days, according to those who served there, you can see all the way to Salzburg, 30 kilometers to the north, though this depends on atmospheric conditions and the time of year. What we can say with confidence is this. Between 1937 and 1938, the Nazi regime constructed a building in a location so remote, so technically challenging, and so seemingly purposeless for military or administrative function that its existence has puzzled historians, architects, military analysts, and engineering experts for more than 80 years. The structure cost approximately 30 million Reichsmarks, roughly $150 million in today's currency, equivalent to the cost of constructing 3 Type 7 U-boats or equipping an entire Panzer division. It required engineering innovations that would not see widespread civilian use until decades after the war. Stabilized elevator systems for extreme vertical distances, a road construction on grades that exceeded what was considered possible, heating systems that could maintain comfortable temperatures at altitudes where the air pressure is 15% lower than at sea level. The official explanation is that it was a 50th birthday gift from Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy, to Adolf Hitler. The honest answer is that nobody has ever adequately explained why you would give someone a tea house that costs as much as a battleship and can only be reached by a road that kills construction workers at a rate that was considered acceptable only because the workers were considered expendable. The Obersalzberg before the Nazi transformation was a landscape of the sublime in the 18th century sense, beautiful in a way that implied threat. And that inspired awe mixed with terror that made you feel both elevated and infinitely small. Farms clung to slopes at angles that made agriculture an act of faith and stubbornness. The soil was thin, glacial, till mixed with limestone fragments that never quite weathered into proper topsoil. Winters lasted from October through April, with snowfall that could bury ground floor windows and make travel impossible for weeks. The population of the immediate area in 1933 was fewer than 300 people, scattered across an altitudinal range of 3,000 feet in a collection of farms, small dairies, and timber operations that barely sustained themselves. They raised sheep, hardy mountain breeds with thick wool and an ability to find forage on slopes that looked vertical from below. So they cut timber, mostly spruce and larch from the lower elevations, floated down streams in spring when the snowmelt made the water high enough. And in summer months, they accommodated tourists who came for the mountain air, for the hiking, for the increasingly fashionable pursuit of alpinism, and for the illusion of alpine pastoral that required carefully ignoring the poverty, the isolation, and the harshness of the climate that made life here a constant negotiation with cold and gravity. The Königssee, 3 miles to the east, was already famous, a glacial lake 8 kilometers long, 1 kilometer wide at its broadest point, and 190 meters deep. The water is so cold and so pure that it appears almost black in certain lights, a darkness that comes from depth and clarity combined. Bodies dropped into the Königssee in medieval times were said never to surface, preserved in the lightless pressure of the depths, though this is almost certainly myth. What is documented is that the lake freezes completely, perhaps once per decade, and when it does, the ice is thick enough to walk on and clear enough to see fish swimming beneath your feet. The mountains themselves are Dachstein limestone, deposited during the Triassic period when this region was a shallow tropical sea. The stone is pale gray, almost white in certain lights, and it fractures along clean vertical planes that make it excellent for construction. You can cut blocks with minimal waste, but extremely unstable for tunneling. The fracture planes allow water infiltration, and water, freezing and thawing in the cracks, splits the rock from within. This geological fact will become critically important to understanding why the engineering of the Eagle's Nest was so challenging and why 12 men died during construction. Adolf Hitler first visited the Obersalzberg in April 1923. He was 34 years old, recently released from Landsberg prison after serving less than a year for his role in the failed beer hall putsch in Munich, and the Nazi Party was a regional Bavarian faction with perhaps 20,000 members and no national influence whatsoever. He came on the recommendation of Dietrich Eckart, an early mentor and financial supporter who knew the area and believed that Hitler needed rest and solitude to write the book that would become Mein Kampf. Hitler rented a small house called Haus Wachenfeld from the widow of a Hamburg businessman named Winter for 100 Reichsmarks per month. The house was modest, 2 stories, wood construction typical of Bavarian alpine architecture, a pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow, and a view of the Untersberg Massif to the north. The Untersberg is a mountain on the border between Germany and Austria, 2,400 meters high, and it holds a peculiar place in German folklore. According to medieval legend, Charlemagne, or in some versions, Frederick Barbarossa, sleeps in a cave inside the mountain, waiting to return when Germany needs him most. The legend specifies that ravens circle the mountain, and when the ravens disappear, the emperor will wake. Hitler knew this legend. Everyone in Bavaria knew this legend. Whether it influenced his attachment to the location is speculation, but it is documented that he mentioned the Untersberg frequently and always with a tone that those who heard him described as reverent. Hitler, who had been born in Braunau am Inn in Austria, who had failed the entrance examination for the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice, who had spent the Great War as a corporal in the List Regiment earning the Iron Cross, but never promoted beyond the lowest enlisted rank, found in the Obersalzberg something that satisfied a part of his psyche that had no clear political function. He walked the mountain trails for hours, often alone, sometimes covering 20 or 30 kilometers in a day. He stood on overlooks and stared at the Austrian border, visible as a political abstraction that cut through valleys and over peaks with no regard for the shape of the land. Those who knew him in this period, Rudolf Hess, who often accompanied him on walks, Julius Schaub, his personal adjutant, even the local farmers who rented him the house, describe a man who seemed genuinely at peace in the mountains in a way he never appeared at rest anywhere else. In cities in Munich or Berlin, Hitler was manic, volatile, driven by energies that seemed to consume him. In the mountains, he was quieter. He sketched, he read, he talked about architecture and music and the operas of Wagner in a way that suggested these were not affectations, but genuine interests, things that mattered to him independently of their political utility. Whether this peace was restorative, whether the mountains gave him something he needed to function, or whether it fed some aspect of his pathology that required a sense of elevation, physical and metaphorical, a place from which to look down and imagine domination, is a question that remains genuinely open and probably unanswerable. By 1933, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, and Haus Wachenfeld had been transformed. Renamed the Berghof, the Mountain Court, it was now a sprawling complex with multiple buildings, a great hall whose picture window measured 9 meters wide and 3 meters tall, supposedly the largest single pane of glass manufactured in Europe at that time. The window could be lowered into the floor via a hydraulic mechanism designed by Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, so that on pleasant days the interior and exterior spaces merged and the hall became essentially an open-air pavilion at 3,000 feet. The Berghof was not a retreat. It was a seat of government. Foreign dignitaries visited and were received in the Great Hall with the Alps as backdrop. Neville Chamberlain came in September 1938, stayed overnight, and conducted the negotiations that would lead to the Munich Agreement in rooms where the dominant sensory experience was the view. Mussolini visited. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, and Wallis Simpson visited in October 1937 and were photographed on the terrace, looking relaxed and smiling, a visit that would haunt the Duke's reputation for the rest of his life. Diplomatic meetings that shaped the trajectory toward the Second World War were conducted in an environment deliberately designed to awe and intimidate. The mountains as a kind of silent partner in negotiation, their scale and indifference to human concerns making the visitors feel small, making Hitler, who was at home here, seem larger. The complex grew. Staff housing for dozens of secretaries, adjutants, valets, drivers, guards. Barracks for the SS detachment. By 1938, more than 200 men of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were permanently stationed at the Obersalzberg, tasked with security for a perimeter that eventually extended several kilometers in all directions. A greenhouse where tropical orchids were cultivated at 3,000 feet, heated through Bavarian winters at enormous expense, because Eva Braun liked orchids and someone had decided this was a priority. A kindergarten for the children of staff, though Hitler himself disliked children and avoided them. A tea house, not the Eagle's Nest, a different tea house, lower down the mountain, more accessible, where Hitler actually did take afternoon tea with visitors, and where the architect, Alois Degano, had designed a circular room with windows facing all directions and a table that could seat 12. A bowling alley, a movie theater with seating for 50, where Hitler watched films almost every night. American films often, which continued to be imported and screened privately, even after the war began, and Hollywood was officially enemy territory. And beneath all of this, beginning in 1943, when it became clear that air raids would reach even here, an extensive bunker system dug into the mountainside, tunnels, reinforced rooms, ventilation systems, emergency exits, a subterranean complex that eventually encompassed more than 4 kilometers of passageways cut through the same Dachstein limestone that made tunneling so difficult. The entire Obersalzberg was transformed into a fortified administrative complex by 1938. Restricted roads with checkpoints where your papers were examined by armed SS guards. A permanent population of several thousand people, SS, staff, laborers, construction workers, the various functionaries required to maintain what amounted to a government in the mountains. The local population, the farmers and timber workers who had lived here for generations, were increasingly pushed out. Their land was purchased, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure that was coercive even when it was technically legal. By 1936, the Nazi Party controlled most of the Obersalzberg, and by 1938, the area was essentially closed to anyone without authorization. If you had lived here in 1920, you could walk freely. By 1938, if you approached without papers, you would be stopped by men with submachine guns. And 5 miles south by road, 1,000 feet higher in elevation, inaccessible except by a single route cut into cliffs and served by an elevator through solid rock, visible from the Berghof as a pale structure on a distant peak, was the Eagle's Nest. The idea, according to Martin Bormann's documented correspondence held in various archives, including the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, originated in May 1936. A Bormann, who by this time controlled Hitler's personal finances through the Adolf Hitler Endowment of German Industry, a fund that collected donations from German corporations and had accumulated millions of Reichsmarks, and who increasingly controlled the administrative apparatus of the Nazi state through his position as chief of the party chancellery, proposed a structure on the Kehlstein summit to mark Hitler's 50th birthday in April 1939. The proposal was made to the Gauleiter of Bavaria, Adolf Wagner, who approved it, and to Hitler himself, who, according to Bormann's own notes, expressed mild interest but did not follow the project closely. The engineering surveys began in June 1937, conducted by a firm from Munich called Hochtief AG, specialists in alpine construction. What they revealed was that the project was, from a construction standpoint, somewhere between extremely difficult and genuinely absurd. The Kehlstein Peak is a limestone tower that rises 1,000 feet above the already elevated Obersalzberg. The slopes on all sides average 60 to 70 degrees, not cliffs, but steep enough that climbing without technical equipment is dangerous and, in winter, impossible. There is no water source on the summit, no existing road or trail that could support vehicle traffic, no soil to speak of, just rock and whatever thin organic matter accumulates in cracks where plants manage to take root. The rock itself, that Dachstein limestone, is fractured. The fracture planes run vertically, which is good for cutting building stone, but terrible for structural stability. Water infiltrates the cracks, freezes, expands and splits the rock further. The summit is exposed to weather systems that move through the Alps with a speed and ferocity that makes construction work impossible for weeks at a time. Wind speeds above 100 kilometers per hour are routine from October through May. Snow can fall in any month. In July 1937, during the initial survey, 6 inches of snow fell overnight, and work stopped for 3 days. The temperature range between summer and winter spans more than 60 degrees Celsius, from highs of 25 degrees in August to lows of -35 in February. And the purpose of the building, as specified in Bormann's proposal, was to be a representation house, a representations house, where Hitler might occasionally receive guests and enjoy the view. The construction proceeded anyway. Our Bormann appointed an engineer named Karl Piepenburg to oversee the project. Piepenburg was 43, a civil engineer who had worked on road projects in the Alps and had a reputation for solving problems that other engineers considered unsolvable. His initial assessment, documented in a report dated August 1937, was that the project would require 2 years, cost 25 to 30 million Reichsmarks, and would be dangerous enough that worker casualties should be expected and accepted. Bormann approved the budget. The timeline was acceptable. Construction would be complete with months to spare before the April 1939 birthday. The casualties were not discussed as a moral question, only as a practical one: how to maintain a labor force when workers were injured or killed at a rate higher than normal construction projects. The road was built first. The Kehlsteinstrasse is 6.5 kilometers long and rises 450 meters from the valley station near the Berghof to the parking area below the summit. The road had to be cut directly into the mountainside, which meant that for much of its length there was no foundation in the conventional sense, just rock on one side and empty air on the other. The construction technique required workers to be lowered on ropes from above to positions where they could drill holes for explosives, blast away sections of the mountainside, and create a rough roadbed that other workers would then smooth and grade. The men who did this work, most of them Bavarian, some from Austria, a few from other parts of Germany, were paid slightly above standard wages for construction labor, and they were aware of the risks. They were also aware that refusing the work was not really an option, not in Germany in 1937, when unemployment had only recently fallen, and when the Nazi regime did not look kindly on those who declined opportunities to contribute to national projects. The road has 5 tunnels blasted through rock outcroppings, where it was easier to go through than to go around. The longest tunnel is 112 meters, cut through solid limestone, wide enough for a single vehicle. Inside, even today, the walls show the marks of the drilling, regular patterns of holes where explosives were placed, surfaces rough because there was no need for polish, only function. The road has 7 major hairpin turns, each one engineered to allow vehicles to reverse direction while climbing a grade that averages 12%, but in places exceeds 18%. Modern tour buses navigate these turns with difficulty, requiring a spotter to walk ahead and ensure no one is coming the other way. In the original design, there were no guardrails. The outer edge of the road was simply a cliff. You drove with the certainty that a mistake, a moment of inattention, a mechanical failure, ice on the road in the months when the road was used despite winter conditions, would send you over the edge and down slopes steep enough that survival was unlikely. Guardrails were added after the war, a concession to safety that would have been considered unnecessary, perhaps even weak during construction. Construction workers, approximately 3,000 men, cycled through the project over 18 months with a peak workforce of about 500 men working simultaneously during the summer months of 1938. Worked in conditions that were unforgiving even by the standards of large alpine projects like the Grossglockner High Alpine Road or the railway tunnels through the Gotthard. The workday began at dawn and continued until dark, or until weather made work impossible, whichever came first. Men worked 6 days per week. They lived in barracks constructed at the base of the mountain, wooden structures heated by coal stoves, sleeping 50 to 60 men per building in conditions that were crowded but dry. Food was adequate: bread, potatoes, meat twice per week, beer in the evenings. Medical care was available. A doctor on site, though the injuries that mattered, falls, crush injuries from rock slides, blast injuries from explosives, were often beyond what field medicine could address. 12 men died. This number is documented in the final construction report submitted by Piepenburg to Bormann in March 1939. The report lists causes: falls, 4 men, 1 from a cliff while positioning explosives, 3 from scaffolding during tunnel construction. Rock slides, 3 men caught when blasting destabilized sections of the mountain that collapsed without warning. Exposure, 2 men lost in a sudden snowstorm in November 1937 while working on the upper sections of the road. Their bodies found 3 days later frozen in positions that suggested they had tried to descend and become disoriented in whiteout conditions. Blast injuries, 2 men, 1 killed when a charge detonated prematurely, another when a misdrilled hole caused an explosion to fracture the rock in an unexpected direction, sending fragments through his chest. 1 case, drowning, though the report does not explain how a man drowns while building a mountain road, and no other documentation clarifies this. The deaths were considered acceptable losses. The phrase used in Piepenburg's report is, within expected parameters for a project of this type and scale. The families of the dead workers received compensation. Amounts are not specified, but there are references to payments made through the party's labor front. The work continued without pause. The schedule was maintained. What the schedule was for remains genuinely unclear. The elevator shaft is the most technically sophisticated element of the entire complex, and in many ways, the most puzzling. The shaft descends 124 meters through solid Dockstein limestone at an angle that is almost perfectly vertical. The deviation from true vertical is less than 2 degrees over the entire length. Drilling this required removing approximately 70,000 cubic meters of rock, done using rotary drills that had to be anchored to the mountain and operated continuously. The drilling proceeded from the top down, which meant that as the shaft deepened, removing the debris became progressively more difficult. A system of buckets and cables was rigged to haul broken rock to the surface, where it was dumped over the side of the mountain to fall thousands of feet into valleys that still contain, if you know where to look, piles of limestone rubble from this operation. The shaft is lined with brass and fitted with a single elevator car capable of carrying 40 people, though in practice it was rarely filled to capacity. The car itself is lined with Venetian mirrors, real mirrors, polished glass backed with silver, set into frames of brass that was buffed to a reflective finish. The ceiling is green leather, tooled in a pattern of oak leaves. The floor is polished brass plate with a non-slip surface created by subtle texturing. The controls are simple, 2 buttons labeled off and ab, up and down. There is no emergency stop, no alarm, no communication system. You enter, you press a button, and the car moves. The ascent takes 41 seconds. The descent takes 43 seconds, slightly longer because the car is heavier when loaded, and the braking system requires more time to decelerate safely. In 1938, this was the highest elevator in Germany, and possibly in all of Europe, depending on how you measure. It was certainly the deepest elevator shaft drilled through mountain rock anywhere in the world at that time. The engineering required to prevent the car from jamming. The rock expands and contracts with temperature changes. The shaft can shift slightly as internal stresses in the mountain redistribute. Moisture infiltration can cause ice formation in winter. Was novel enough that the chief engineer, a man named Müller, whose first name appears in some documents as Friedrich and in others as Franz, suggesting record-keeping was less than perfect, published a technical paper in 1951 in a German engineering journal about the stabilization mechanisms. The paper describes a system of spring-loaded guide rails that allow the car to move smoothly even when the shaft dimensions change slightly. It describes heating elements embedded in the shaft walls to prevent ice formation. It describes the cable system, 4 independent cables, each capable of supporting the full weight of the loaded car, so that the failure of 3 cables would still leave the car suspended safely. The paper makes no mention of what the elevator was for, or why it was built, or who commissioned it. Only how it worked, the technical problems encountered, and the solutions implemented. Müller, who survived the war and worked on various construction projects in rebuilt Germany until his retirement in 1968, gave one interview in 1963 to a local Bavarian newspaper in which he was asked about the eagle's nest. His response, quoted in the article, was, "It was a job. We were told what to build, and we built it. Why it was needed was not our concern." At the top of the shaft, you emerge into a circular room cut from the mountain itself, 10 meters in diameter. The walls are raw limestone, left exposed intentionally, the stone showing tool marks where it was cut but otherwise unfinished. The ceiling is domed, also cut from rock, with a central oculus that is glazed with thick glass to allow natural light. The floor is polished marble, Carrara marble from Italy, white with gray veining, in the same stone Michelangelo preferred for sculpture. The contrast is deliberate: raw stone walls, refined stone floor, a space that is simultaneously cave and palace. From this room, a tunnel 124 meters long, also cut through rock, leads to the building. The tunnel is wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast comfortably, or for 4 people to walk in a tight group. It is 2.4 meters high, tall enough that most people can walk upright without concern, though taller individuals must duck slightly. The ceiling is arched, engineered, using principles of stone vaulting that date to Roman times, but executed with modern precision. The arch distributes the weight of the mountain, pressing down from above outward toward the walls, where it is absorbed by the surrounding rock mass. The tunnel is lit by brass fixtures set into the stone at intervals of 10 meters. The fixtures are simple, frosted glass globes with incandescent bulbs inside, each producing a warm yellow light that reflects off the moisture that seeps constantly through the limestone. The floor is polished marble, the same Carrara marble as the elevator chamber, laid in sections with expansion joints every 5 meters to allow for the rock's movement without cracking the stone. Walking this tunnel produces a distinct psychological effect that has been documented by enough people: soldiers who first entered in 1945, tourists in the decades since, historians and journalists who have written about the site, that we can treat it as a consistent phenomenon rather than subjective impression. The effect is one of compression, of weight, of being inside something that is waiting to close. The rational mind knows the tunnel is stable, that it has stood for more than 80 years without collapse, that modern engineering assessments confirm its structural integrity. But the emotional response remains. You are walking through a mountain beneath millions of tons of rock, in a passage that exists only because human beings decided to cut it, and which could, in principle, cease to exist if the rock decided otherwise. The stone weeps moisture in spring when snow melt percolates through the fractures in the limestone above. The water is clear, mineral-free, cold enough that it numbs your hand if you hold it under the drip. In winter, ice forms in pale sheets along the walls, growing from the moisture that condenses when cold air from outside meets the relatively warmer air of the tunnel, which is heated slightly by the residual warmth from the elevator machinery. The ice formations are delicate, feathered, almost fern-like in their branching structure, and they melt in spring, leaving no trace except the dampness. The tunnel was designed not for utility, but for procession. You are meant to feel the weight of where you are. You are meant to arrive at the building with a sense of having earned access through passage, through descent and ascent, through traveling inside the earth before emerging into the light. The building at the end of the tunnel is small, smaller than the effort required to reach it would seem to justify. The footprint is approximately 350 square meters, roughly equivalent to a modest suburban house. The main room, the only room of any significant size, is approximately 15 meters long and 10 meters wide, with a ceiling height that varies from 3.2 meters at the walls to 4.8 meters at the center, where exposed wooden beams support the roof. The fireplace is along one wall, constructed of red Italian marble, Rosso Verona, a Jurassic limestone colored by iron oxide, quarried near Verona, and shipped north through the Brenner Pass. The marble is polished to a reflective finish, and the fireplace itself is massive, 2.3 meters wide, 1.8 meters tall, designed to burn logs that are more than a meter long. The fireplace was a gift from Mussolini, documented in correspondence between the Italian and German governments in late 1938. Why Mussolini gave Hitler's mountain tea house a marble fireplace is not explained in the correspondence, only that it was given, that it was transported at Italian government expense, and that it was installed by Italian stonemasons who traveled to Bavaria specifically for this purpose. The windows face south and west, positioned to capture the view across the Alps and to maximize afternoon light. There are 6 windows in total, each one 2.2 meters tall and 1.4 meters wide, set into walls that are 1 meter thick. The thickness is not for insulation, though it serves that purpose, but because the building sits on bedrock at an elevation where wind pressure can exceed what standard construction would withstand. The walls are limestone block, cut from the same Dachstein formation that the building sits upon, even so that the structure appears to grow from the mountain rather than rest upon it. The glass is not particularly large by the standards set by the Berghof's great window, but the effect here is different. At the Berghof, the window was a frame that held the landscape, a picture that you looked at. Here, at this elevation, the windows are apertures in stone that feels less like a building than a cave that happens to have been finished. You are aware, always, that outside is 6,000 feet of nothing, that the ground is distant enough to be abstract, that you are suspended in air at a height where birds are below you. The room contains furniture that was crafted specifically for this space, commissioned from workshops in Munich and Bavaria, and delivered up the mountain road in pieces that were assembled on site. Heavy oak tables, on one of them 3 meters long, designed to seat 12 people, though there is no documented occasion when 12 people dined here simultaneously. Chairs upholstered in leather, dark brown, thick hide that was soft when new and has since aged to a texture like gloves that have been worn for years. A Gobelin tapestry on one wall, 4 meters wide and 3 meters tall, depicting a hunting scene from the 17th century. Nobles on horseback, dogs, a stag at bay in a forest that looks nothing like the Alps, but everything like the idealized German woodland that existed more in imagination than in reality. The tapestry was purchased from a dealer in Vienna in 1938, cost 30,000 Reichsmarks, and its presence here, in a room that is otherwise austere, modern, and almost Spartan in its simplicity, is one of those details that invites interpretation but resists definitive explanation. There is a small side room, more of a niche than a room, with a bar fitted with crystal glassware from Bohemia and bottles of schnapps, plum, pear, gentian, and French cognac and Scotch whiskey. The bottles are arranged on glass shelves backlit by small electric bulbs, creating a display that would not be out of place in a high-end hotel. A kitchen, though there is no staff housing, no sleeping quarters for cooks or servers, which means any food served here had to be prepared at the Berghof 5 miles and 1,000 feet below, transported up the mountain road in insulated containers and served quickly before it cooled. And a bathroom with fixtures of the highest quality available in the late 1930s. Porcelain from Villeroy and Boch, chrome-plated brass fittings, a toilet, a sink, hot and cold running water supplied by tanks that are heated electrically and filled from snowmelt collected on the roof and filtered. And that is all. No bedrooms, no offices, no secure communications equipment, no staff quarters, no fortifications, no gun emplacements, no strategic value whatsoever from a military standpoint. Adolf Hitler, by multiple documented accounts from sources including his valet Heinz Linge, his secretaries Traudl Junge and Christa Schroeder, and his adjutant Julius Schaub, visited the Eagle's Nest fewer than 20 times over the 7-year period between its completion in 1938 and the end of the war in 1945. He disliked it. He complained about the altitude, about the thinness of the air which he said made him feel lightheaded and short of breath. He complained about the wind, which was constant and loud enough that conversation near the windows required raised voices. He suffered from chronic stomach pain and insomnia, conditions that were worsening throughout the late 30s and early 40s, treated with an increasingly bizarre regimen of drugs administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, and the elevation exacerbated both. The air pressure at 6,000 feet is approximately 15% lower than at sea level, which affects digestion and sleep in ways that are well documented in altitude medicine. For someone already suffering from gastrointestinal issues, the effect is amplified. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion and, in the final day of his life, his wife, visited more frequently. She brought guests, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda, Albert Speer, Heinrich Hoffmann, the photographer, various other members of what might be called the social circle of the regime, though that phrase makes it sound less sinister than it was. These visits are documented in photographs, many taken by Hoffmann, showing people in casual dress sitting at the oak table, standing by the windows, posing on the terrace that wraps around the south and west sides of the building. The photographs show sunshine, leisure, people laughing, mountains in the background. They show a world that looks almost normal, which is among the most disturbing things about them. But even these events were infrequent. The building, and which had cost 30 million Reichsmarks and 12 lives, sat mostly empty. In winter, it was completely inaccessible, the road closed by snow from October through May, no possibility of clearing it because the grades and the exposure made snow removal both dangerous and pointless. In summer, it was used perhaps a dozen times per year, and then only for a few hours at a time. After 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began and the war in the Soviet Union consumed Hitler's attention and time, when his headquarters moved to various fortified locations in East Prussia and Ukraine, when the Berghof itself saw less use as the war turned against Germany, he stopped visiting the Eagle's Nest entirely. The last documented visit was in June 1942. After that, the building sat empty, maintained by a small staff who cleaned it and ensured the heating system prevented freeze damage, but otherwise unused, a monument to something that had never quite happened. Why then was it built? This is the question that has occupied historians, and the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. We have theories, some more plausible than others, but no definitive explanation that accounts for all the facts. The scale, the cost, the timing, the location, the apparent uselessness. The official explanation, Bormann's birthday gift to Hitler, makes a certain surface sense. Martin Bormann was, by 1936, one of the most powerful men in Germany. He controlled Hitler's personal finances through the Adolf Hitler Endowment of German Industry, a fund that collected mandatory and voluntary donations from German corporations and had accumulated an estimated 700 million Reichsmarks by 1945. He controlled access to Hitler increasingly as the war progressed, deciding who could see the Führer and when, a power that in a dictatorship is equivalent to controlling reality itself. He was intensely loyal to Hitler personally in a way that was unusual even in a regime built on loyalty oaths and personal bonds. A 50th birthday in April 1939, when Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland in defiance of Versailles, had annexed Austria in the Anschluss, had absorbed the Sudetenland through the Munich Agreement, and was months away from the invasion of Poland that would begin the Second World War, might warrant a monument. A gesture of devotion on a scale that matched the moment. But the scale is wrong. 30 million Reichsmarks is not a gift. It is a statement. To put this in perspective, the entire Berghof renovation and expansion, which transformed Hitler's modest rental house into a sprawling governmental complex, cost approximately 18 million Reichsmarks over a period of 6 years. The Eagle's Nest, a single building used a fraction of the time, cost nearly twice as much. And the statement, if that's what it was, is unclear. What does it say? That Bormann could mobilize this much money and labor? That Hitler deserved a monument at this scale? That the regime had reached a point where cost was no object and human life was expendable in pursuit of architectural gestures? And there is the timing problem. The project began in June 1937, more than 2 years before Hitler's birthday. If it was a surprise gift, Bormann managed to keep construction involving 3,000 workers, visible for miles, requiring road closures and material shipments and engineering surveys, secret for 18 months. This strains credibility. Hitler visited the Berghof regularly during this period. He could see the Kehlstein from the terrace. He would have noticed road construction, would have asked questions. The alternative is that it wasn't a surprise, that Hitler knew about the project and approved it, in which case calling it a gift is semantics. It becomes a commission, a project undertaken at Hitler's request, or at least with his knowledge and consent, which raises the question of why he would commission something he then barely used and actively disliked. A second theory, advanced by historians who focus on the internal dynamics of the Nazi hierarchy, Ian Kershaw in his biography of Hitler, Peter Longerich in his work on the Nazi elite, others, is that the Eagle's Nest was less a gift to Hitler than a demonstration by Bormann of his own power. By 1937, the Nazi regime was not a monolith, but a collection of competing power centers. Hermann Göring controlled the Luftwaffe and much of the four-year plan for economic preparation for war. Joseph Goebbels controlled propaganda and had Hitler's ear on cultural matters. Heinrich Himmler controlled the SS and was building an empire within the state. Bormann's power was less visible, but in some ways more fundamental. He controlled access. He controlled money. He controlled the machinery of the party bureaucracy. The Eagle's Nest, in this interpretation, was a message to rivals. Look what I can accomplish. I can mobilize millions of Reichsmarks, coordinate thousands of workers, solve impossible engineering problems, complete a project of this scale on time and within budget. If I can do this for a tea house, imagine what I could do if I decided you were a problem. This theory accounts for the scale and the ambition. It explains why the project might have been undertaken even if Hitler was not particularly enthusiastic. Bormann didn't need Hitler to love the Eagle's Nest. He needed it to exist, to be undeniable, to demonstrate capability. But this interpretation does not explain the design. If the goal was a demonstration of power, why a tea house? Why the Italian marble fireplace, the Venetian mirrors, the crystal glassware, the Gobelin tapestry? A fortress would demonstrate power. A command bunker with communications equipment and reinforced walls. A barracks for an expanded SS garrison. A weapons depot. The Eagle's Nest is none of these things. It is a space designed for aesthetic experience, for the refined appreciation of elevation and view, for hosting small groups in an environment of extreme and deliberate luxury. The disconnect between the effort required to build it and the use to which it was put remains unexplained by this theory. A third possibility, less discussed in mainstream histories but present in architectural analyses and in technical assessments of the construction, is that the Eagle's Nest was a kind of rehearsal, a proof of concept for engineering techniques that would be applied elsewhere. The Nazi regime was, by 1937, already planning extensive underground facilities. The Führerhauptquartiere, the various military headquarters where Hitler would conduct the war, required bunkers cut into rock, ventilation systems that could maintain air quality in sealed environments, blast-proof construction. The V-weapon program would eventually require underground factories like the Mittelbau-Dora complex at Nordhausen, where V-2 rockets were assembled using slave labor in tunnels carved through mountains. The Atlantic Wall fortifications required engineering solutions for construction in difficult terrain. The techniques developed at the Eagle's Nest, drilling elevator shafts through fractured rock, preventing ice formation in underground passages, stabilizing structures at high altitude, heating systems for extreme environments. All of these had military applications. In this reading, the Eagle's Nest was a test bed. Build it as a tea house, call it a gift, and nobody pays attention to the fact that you're solving problems that will be useful later for facilities that are decidedly not for leisure. The project attracts skilled engineers, allows them to develop expertise, creates a body of technical knowledge that can be applied to military construction without having to explain why you're drilling practice elevator shafts through mountains. A tea house is harmless. It draws no particular international attention. It's a vanity project, perhaps, an expensive gesture, but it's not threatening. And meanwhile, you're learning how to build underground fortresses. The difficulty with this interpretation is that it requires a level of long-term planning and strategic thinking that does not fit the chaotic, personality-driven, short-term nature of Nazi decision-making. The regime was not known for 5-year plans that were actually followed. It was known for improvisations, for decisions made on impulse or whim, for personal rivalries shaping policy, for Hitler's intuitions overriding rational analysis. The idea that someone in 1936 thought, "We'll need underground factories in 3 years. So let's build a tea house to practice," is plausible in the abstract, but hard to reconcile with what we know about how the regime actually functioned. Plans changed constantly. Priorities shifted. What seemed important in 1936 might be irrelevant by 1938. To invest 30 million Reichsmarks in a rehearsal for projects that might not happen requires a confidence in the future that seems inconsistent with the regime's general approach. And yet, the techniques developed at the Eagle's Nest were used later. The engineers who worked on the Kelstein project did go on to work on military construction. The knowledge gained was applied. Whether this was intentional from the start or a fortunate coincidence, whether the rehearsal interpretation is correct or simply a pattern we're imposing on events that had no such coherence, remains open to debate. There is a fourth possibility, which is less a theory than an admission of the limits of rational explanation. The Eagle's Nest may have been built because Martin Bormann wanted to build it, because the resources were available, because the idea of a building at the top of a mountain appealed to some aesthetic or psychological need that we cannot access from this historical distance. Not everything the Nazis built had a rational purpose measured in strategic advantage or political utility. The regime was, in many ways, a cult of the Führer, yes, but also a cult of the monumental, of the will to power expressed in stone and steel, of the belief that greatness required grand gestures regardless of cost. The Eagle's Nest, in this interpretation, is an artifact of that cult mentality. It was built because it could be built, because building it was an assertion of dominance over nature, because placing a structure on an impossible summit was a way of saying, "We do not accept limits." This is the least satisfying explanation because it does not provide closure. It does not answer why with anything definitive. But it may be the most honest. The regime made decisions that, from our perspective, look insane, invading the Soviet Union, declaring war on the United States, pursuing the final solution, even when it diverted resources from the war effort. Why would we expect its architectural decisions to be more rational? Or the Eagle's Nest may simply be another expression of a pathology that expressed itself in many forms, some military, some political, some architectural. A mountain peak demanded to be conquered, so it was conquered, not with an expedition, but with a permanent structure that said, "This belongs to us now." From the summit of the Kelstein, on the rare clear days when the weather permits and the visibility extends beyond the immediate peaks, you can see more than 100 kilometers in multiple directions. To the south, the Austrian Alps layer into the distance, the Hohe Tauern Range, the Großglockner, visible as a white pyramid on the horizon. To the west, the Zugspitze, Germany's highest peak at 2,962 meters. To the north, the Bavarian Plateau, spreading out like a green sea, a lake scattered like silver coins, Munich itself a smudge on the horizon on the clearest days, though this may be wishful seeing, the city being nearly 120 kilometers away. The Alps spread out in layers, gray-white limestone peaks in the foreground, darker granite summits to the south, the haze of distance blurring into the suggestion of Italy beyond. The valley below is a model, perfect and still. Rivers are threads. Lakes are mirrors that catch and hold the sky. The towns are clusters of white and brown. Farms are geometric patches. Forests are textures. From this height, you can see the curvature of the earth, or what appears to be curvature, the horizon bending slightly at the edges of vision. Though whether this is actual curvature or an optical effect produced by atmospheric refraction and the psychology of height is something even modern observers cannot agree on definitively. The view is, by all accounts, extraordinary. It is also, in a practical sense, completely useless. You cannot govern from 6,000 feet. You cannot command armies. You cannot, in fact, do much of anything except look. The isolation is total. There are no roads beyond the one that brought you here. No neighbors, no town within walking distance, even in summer. In winter, you are cut off entirely. The radio reception is poor. The mountains block signals, create dead zones. In 1938, maintaining communications with the Berghof required telephone lines strung along the road, vulnerable to weather, to falling rock, yet to ice that snapped the lines and left the eagle's nest in silence. It is a beautiful prison, a gilded isolation, and yet the building remains. The eagle's nest survived the war intact, which is itself remarkable. The Royal Air Force bombed the Obersalzberg extensively on April 25, 1945. The same day, Sergeant Miller stood at the elevator door, wondering what he was securing. The bombing raid involved 318 Lancasters and 16 Mosquitoes from No. 5 Group RAF, dropping more than 1,300 tons of bombs on an area roughly 2 kilometers by 1 kilometer. The target was the Berghof and the surrounding SS barracks, the bunker systems, the administrative buildings, anything that might serve as a last refuge for what remained of the Nazi leadership. The raid was devastating. The Berghof was gutted, the roof collapsed, the great window shattered, the interior reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The bunker systems were hit, though their depth saved them from complete destruction. Much of the complex was reduced to ruins. Fires burned for 3 days. The photographs taken afterward show a landscape that looks like the surface of a shattered planet. Craters, rubble, skeletal remains of buildings. But the eagle's nest, 5 miles away and 1,000 feet higher, was untouched. Not a single bomb fell near it. Whether this was because it was not considered a worthwhile target, a tea house has no military value, or because the altitude and the terrain made it difficult to bomb accurately, or because by April 1945 the war was effectively over and resources were focused on targets that might still matter, and is unclear. The mission planners at RAF Bomber Command would have had to decide whether to allocate aircraft to a secondary target in difficult terrain or focus entirely on the primary target in the valley. They chose focus. The eagle's nest was not on anyone's target list that day. When American forces arrived on May 4th, elements of the 3rd Infantry Division advancing from the west, encountering no resistance because the SS garrison had withdrawn days earlier, they found the building pristine. The furniture was still in place, arranged as if for guests who might arrive at any moment. The tapestry on the wall, the crystal in the bar, unbroken, the brass elevator gleaming, the mechanism functioning perfectly. Eva Braun's perfume lingering in enclosed spaces, a smell that Sergeant Miller and others remarked on in their accounts. A detail that feels almost impossible, but is documented in multiple independent sources. The building had been maintained until the very end. Someone had been cleaning, heating, ensuring everything remained perfect, even as the regime collapsed and the Red Army closed on Berlin and Hitler prepared for suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. In the immediate post-war years, there was debate about what to do with it. The French wanted it preserved as a monument to the regime's excesses, a cautionary display. The Americans were less interested. It was in their occupation zone, their responsibility to decide. Some argued for demolition as part of the broader denazification effort that saw symbols of the regime destroyed across Germany. The party rally grounds in Nuremberg were partially demolished, though the scale made complete removal impractical. The Berghof was dynamited by the Bavarian state government in 1952, the ruins left as a scar and a warning, later cleared entirely, and the site returned to forest. The logic was clear. Some things should not be allowed to stand, should not become shrines or pilgrimage sites for those who might want to remember the regime fondly. but the Eagle's Nest presented complications. It was architecturally remarkable. The elevator alone was a significant engineering achievement. The building itself, stripped of its Nazi associations, was a well-designed structure in a spectacular location. And, more pragmatically, it had potential as a tourist site, a source of revenue for a region that desperately needed economic recovery. By the early 1950s, the Obersalzberg was already attracting visitors curious to see where Hitler had lived, to stand where history had happened. The phenomenon was uncomfortable. No one wanted to celebrate the regime, but denying that it had existed or erasing all traces seemed both impossible and somehow wrong, a form of forgetting that might allow repetition. The decision was made to preserve the Eagle's Nest, but to contextualize it, to transform it from a Nazi monument into a historical site with educational purpose. In 1952, the Bavarian state took ownership of the building and the road. In 1954, it reopened as a restaurant and mountain hut, operated by a private company, under lease from the state. The elevator was refurbished, the brass polished, the mechanical systems updated to modern safety standards. The road was paved and reinforced, guardrails installed, turnouts created at the hairpin turns to allow vehicles to pass safely. The structure itself was carefully maintained, though all Nazi symbols were removed. The tapestry was taken down and placed in storage. Any decorations bearing swastikas or SS runes were stripped away. The portrait of Hitler that had hung in the main room was destroyed. What remained was the shell, the stone, the view, the elevator, the improbable fact of the building's existence. The decision was, in its way, very German. Practical, thorough, unwilling to romanticize, but also unwilling to pretend that history can be deleted by demolition. Today, the Eagle's Nest is one of the most visited tourist sites in Bavaria. And more than 300,000 people ascend the Kehlsteinstrasse each year between May and October when the road is open. They take special buses from the parking area at the base. Private vehicles are not permitted on the road, both for safety and to control the flow of traffic. The buses are modern coaches with large windows, driven by professional drivers who know every turn, every blind corner, every place where oncoming traffic requires stopping and backing to a turnout. The ride takes 15 minutes. The passengers are tourists from everywhere. Germany, yes, but also America, Japan, China, Korea, Britain, France, Italy, Australia. They come to see history, to stand where something significant happened, to experience the view that Hitler saw, even if he saw it rarely and disliked it when he did. They take the elevator, the same elevator, though the car has been replaced and the mechanisms updated. 41 seconds through the mountain. They walk the tunnel through the stone, taking photographs of the dripping limestone walls, of the ice formations if it's early in the season, of themselves in a space that feels like it should be in a fantasy novel rather than accessible by bus tour. They emerge into the building and find a restaurant serving traditional Bavarian food: schnitzel, sausages, potato salad, apple strudel, beer from local breweries, coffee. They stand at the windows and look at the view and take selfies with the Alps behind them. They buy postcards and souvenirs from a small shop that sells books about the history of the site, hiking maps, small brass models of the elevator. They spend an hour, maybe two, and then they return down the mountain and continue their vacation. The experience is strange. The building is beautiful in the way that well-executed construction is always beautiful. The stone is fitted precisely. The proportions are balanced. The windows frame the landscape perfectly. The materials are high quality and have aged well. The view genuinely is spectacular, worth the trip on its own merits, regardless of history. And it is also a monument to a regime that killed millions, that started a war that killed millions more, that represented human cruelty and systematic evil on a scale that still struggles for adequate description 70 years later. These facts coexist in the same space, and there is no resolution, no way to experience one without the other. The German approach to such sites is careful, deliberate, and evolving. So the eagle's nest is contextualized. At the base of the mountain, at the Documentation Center Obersalzberg, opened in 1999 on the site of the former SS barracks, visitors are provided with historical background. The exhibits cover the Nazi use of the Obersalzberg, the transformation of the region into a seat of government, the crimes planned and ordered from here, the lives of those who lived and worked on the mountain, the devastation of the war, the aftermath. The center is thorough, unflinching, and explicitly educational. The message is clear. You can visit these sites, but you must understand what they represent. You must confront the history, not as entertainment, but as responsibility. At the Eagle's Nest itself, there is less explicit historical interpretation. The building does not have exhibits or placards explaining what happened in each room because mostly nothing happened in each room. It was rarely used. The restaurant operates as a restaurant. But staff are trained to answer questions about the history, and printed materials are available in multiple languages explaining the construction, the purpose, Hitler's infrequent visits, the building's survival and transformation. The tone is factual, neither celebrating nor apologizing, simply presenting information and allowing visitors to form their own responses. But the fact remains. It is there. It functions. It serves schnitzel and beer at 6,000 feet to tourists who pose for photographs in front of windows that once framed a dictator's view, however briefly and reluctantly occupied. And the decision to preserve it rather than destroy it is defensible on multiple grounds: historical, architectural, economic, educational. But it remains a decision that generates discomfort and debate. Some argue that any preservation, however contextualized, risks sanitizing history, making it palatable, allowing people to visit without fully grappling with the horror of what the regime represented. Others argue that destruction would be its own form of evasion, a refusal to confront the physical evidence of what humans are capable of building when power is unconstrained and morality is absent. There is no resolution to this debate, and perhaps there should not be. The discomfort is appropriate. The building should make us uneasy, should resist easy consumption, should force the question of what we do with the monuments of evil regimes. We cannot pretend they never existed. We cannot celebrate them. We must do something in between, and that something is always going to be imperfect, always going to leave room for criticism from multiple directions. The Eagle's Nest, in its strange post-war existence as a tourist restaurant in a Nazi building stripped of Nazi symbols but not of Nazi history, is perhaps as good a solution as we have managed, and that itself should give us pause. What we cannot say with certainty is what the building meant to those who built it. We have the documented facts: the cost of 30 million Reichsmarks, a sum that could have purchased 3 U-boats or equipped an armored division. The timeline from June 1937 to April 1939, 22 months of continuous construction. The engineering specifications: 124-meter elevator shaft through fractured limestone, 6.5-kilometer road with 7 hairpin turns and 5 tunnels, heating systems, water systems, telephone lines. The visitor log showing fewer than 20 visits by Hitler over 7 years, his complaints about the altitude and the wind, his preference for the more accessible tea house lower on the mountain, the accounts of workers and staff, of engineers and architects, of the American soldiers who secured it, and the Bavarian officials who decided its post-war fate. What we do not have is a clear statement of intent that explains why this particular building, in this particular place, at this particular scale, was necessary or even desired. The official explanation, Bormann's birthday gift, is documented in letters and memoranda, but feels insufficient. The scale is too grand for a personal gesture. The timeline suggests planning that began long before the birthday it supposedly celebrated, and the recipient barely used the gift and complained about it when he did. The symbolic explanation, a physical metaphor for Hitler's elevation above ordinary politics, the eagle in his nest above the world, is compelling and fits the regime's use of architecture as propaganda, but does not explain why Hitler avoided the place that was meant to symbolize his greatness. The power demonstration explanation, Bormann proving what he could accomplish to rivals within the hierarchy, accounts for the ambition and the scale, but not the design choices, not the refinement, and not the aestheticization of a project that could have been brutal fortress and accomplished the same demonstration. The rehearsal explanation, testing techniques for underground military facilities, is plausible and supported by the subsequent application of those techniques, but requires a level of forward planning inconsistent with the regime's chaotic decision-making processes. The building, then, is a kind of question in stone and brass. It asks, what does power want when it has no practical limits, when cost is no object, when human life is expendable in service of will? What does ambition look like when the only constraint is the physical possibility of achievement, when 12 deaths are acceptable losses and 30 million Reichsmarks is a birthday gift? And what remains when the regime that built such things is gone, when the people who ordered its construction are dead, when the purpose it might have served, whatever that was, is no longer relevant, leaving only the structure emptied of original meaning, waiting to be filled with new meanings by those who come after? The elevator still rises through the mountain, 41 seconds from the brass door set in the mountainside to the circular room at the top. The tunnel still stretches 124 meters through rock that is 200 million years old, laid down in a shallow Mesozoic sea, lifted and fractured and eroded into the landscape that would one day be called the Alps. The windows still frame the view: Austria to the south, the Königssee to the east, the Berghof's ruins invisible in the valley below, the Untersberg to the north with its sleeping emperor who will wake when Germany needs him, according to legends that predate the regime and will outlast it. The marble fireplace still dominates one wall, though it has not held a fire in decades. Insurance regulations, fire safety in a building that can only be evacuated via a single elevator through a mountain. And tourists still come, 300,000 of them each year, to stand in a room that was meant for a man who visited fewer than 20 times, to see a view he did not particularly enjoy, in a building whose purpose remains, at its core, unexplained. Before we descend from this elevation, consider what we have traced here through stone and history. A road cut into impossible cliffs at the cost of 12 documented deaths and likely others unrecorded. On an elevator through 124 meters of living rock using techniques that were novel in 1938 and remain impressive now. A building at the summit of a mountain designed for leisure and refinement and used so rarely that its existence seems more theoretical than practical. The facts are documented in archives, in engineering reports, in visitor logs, in photographs, in the physical structure itself, which you can visit tomorrow if you choose. But the why, the true why, the reason that makes sense of the scale, and the effort, and the expense, and the deaths, that remains in the realm of the uncertain, the debated, the ultimately unknowable. We can say what was built, 350 square meters of refined space at 6,000 feet, accessible by brass elevator through the heart of a mountain. We can measure it, photograph it, describe its dimensions and materials, and the view from its windows. What we cannot do is recover the intention that drove men to build it, or the meaning it held for those who commissioned it beyond the official explanations that feel insufficient, or the logic that would make a tea house at 6,000 feet anything other than a monument to the inexplicable capacities of human ambition unmoored from practical purpose. The Alps hold the eagle's nest the way stone holds fossils, not with care, not with meaning, not with any judgment on whether what is held deserves preservation, but with the simple fact of endurance. Rock does not care. Mountains do not evaluate. The limestone that cradles the building does not know what the building represents. does not distinguish between Nazi tea house and mountain hut, between monument to dictatorship and tourist attraction. The building is there because it was built strongly enough to withstand weather and time, and because the decisions made after the regime fell leaned toward preservation rather than destruction, toward uncomfortable engagement with history rather than erasure. It serves coffee now, and pastries and beer. The view is the same view it always was. The mountains have not changed, and on clear days, they say, you can see the curvature of the earth, though this is almost certainly an exaggeration, an optical illusion produced by the psychology of extreme elevation and the human tendency to see significance in height, to imagine that from high enough we can finally see clearly. The question the building poses is not, why was this built? We have partial answers, theories, undocumented facts that provide pieces of explanation. The question is what it means that we preserved it, that we climb to it, that we stand in spaces designed for purposes we find abhorrent, and we look at the view, and we eat lunch, and we take photographs. What does it mean to transform monuments of evil into tourist sites? What are we doing when we visit them, confronting history, consuming it, processing it, sanitizing it, all of these things at once? There is no clean answer. There is only the awkward fact of the building and our continued relationship with it. A relationship that says something about how we handle inherited structures that we did not build, did not choose, but now possess, and must decide how to inhabit. From the summit of the Kehlstein, where the air is thin and the wind never stops, and the view extends beyond what can be held in a single glance, where history and tourism and architecture and morality meet in combinations that resist resolution, where questions outnumber answers and discomfort is the appropriate response. Good night.